He only stopped because of the rain and the quiet. The crate was broken taped shut and smelled of dust and forgotten years. $10. That's what Henry Dalton paid for it, thinking maybe he'd use it as firewood. But when he opened it, something looked back. Not a thing, not an object, but a living soul. A German shepherd eyes clouded with something more than age, something like memory. He didn't bark, he didn't move, he just waited. The tag read only one word, Ranger. There was no note, no chip, no explanation, just silence. But in that silence, Henry felt something shift. What he didn't know then was that Ranger had been waiting for him, waiting to lead him not just through old letters and hidden maps, but through grief, regret, and second chances. This wasn't just a dog. This was someone's final message. And opening that crate was never about what he would find inside. It was about what Ranger would help him find within himself. Chapter 1. The Nameless Crate. The morning sky over Willow Creek, Montana was dull, with a gentle overcast haze, the kind that made the world feel soft and slow. A faint breeze carried the earthy scent of pine and damp gravel, as the town's annual garage sale quietly unfolded along the outskirts. Tables stood beneath patched tarps stacked with old board games, mismatched china, and rusted tools. Among the usual clutter of forgotten things, one object sat mostly unnoticed beneath a weathered bench, a wooden crate, half-collapsed edges held together by aging tape and nails that had long since lost their shine. Henry Dalton wasn't looking for anything in particular. In fact, he wasn't looking for anything at all. At 47, recently divorced and tired of the silence in his cedar cabin, he had told himself that morning he'd try to do one spontaneous thing just to see if he still could. His boots scuffed the gravel as he stopped in front of the crate, cocking his head at it. $10, read the faded tag written in blue marker. Sold, he muttered more to himself than to the older woman sitting behind the table. She nodded, once her gray eyes barely lifting from the paperback in her lap, and Henry handed over a $10 bill. He wasn't sure why. The crate looked like it belonged in a bonfire, but something about its silent, stoic presence pulled at him. He slid the crate into the back of his truck and drove home through narrow dirt roads lined with whispering evergreens. The air smelled like cold moss and wood smoke. By the time he parked beside his porch, the sun had begun to dip behind the hills, casting the trees in long slashes of shadow. Inside his cabin, he set the crate down in the middle of the mudroom floor. He knelt, gripping the corners carefully. The tape gave way with a soft crackle, the wood groaned, and as he lifted the lid, he froze. Two amber eyes stared back at him from the darkness. A German shepherd was curled tightly inside its body, thin, its fur dull and matted. The dog didn't bark or flinch. It simply watched. Quiet. Still. Henry's breath caught. He crouched lower, heart racing. The dog's chest rose and fell, slowly. It was alive. Around its neck hung a faded leather collar. On the tag, engraved in small worn letters, was one word, Ranger. Henry Dalton didn't sleep much that night. He lay on his side, eyes open to the darkness, his mind circling the same unanswerable questions. Where had the dog come from? How long had it been trapped in that crate? Who would leave a living animal sealed away like that? Below the thin floorboards, Ranger lay curled at the foot of the stairs, unmoving, silent like a shadow that had decided to stay. When morning came and the first pale light spilled across the wooden floor, Henry found the dog sitting in the exact same position as if he hadn't moved at all. Ranger blinked at him once. It was a slow, deliberate motion, not quite trust, not quite challenge. Just presence. By the time the sun fully rose, Henry had already poured himself a cup of black coffee, stuffed the crate into the bed of his truck, and loaded Ranger gently into the passenger side. The dog resisted at first, not with aggression, but hesitation. his weight shifting backward, muscles tense. Henry took his time speaking in a low voice, a tone of calm that even surprised himself. Finally, Ranger climbed in his movements, stiff and careful. The Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic was a squat brick building across from a faded gas station. Its windows were smudged with condensation, and a wooden sign out front bore the silhouette of a dog and cat curled together. Inside it smelled like antiseptic and cedar shavings. A small bell jingled as Henry stepped in, Ranger trailing behind him on a borrowed leash made from an old climbing rope. The dog walked with a quiet dignity, his gaze sweeping the room with instinctive caution. Behind the front desk stood a woman in her early 50s, short and strong-shouldered, her graying auburn hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. She wore a forest green scrub top and had the kind of face that didn't smile often, but when it did, you knew it meant something. This was Dr. Eliza Corrin, the town's only veterinarian. She'd lived in Willow Creek her whole life, once played softball for the county team, and had a reputation for patching up everything from barn cats to grizzly-bit hounds without fuss. Her voice was even her eyes quick. "You find him wandering?" she asked, already noting details on a clipboard. "Not exactly," Henry said. "He was in a crate. I bought it at a garage sale. I didn't know he was inside." That gave her pause. She looked down at Ranger, who stood still as a statue beside Henry. She approached, slowly letting him sniff the edge of her hand. "Doesn't look abused," she murmured. "But thin, coat's a little dull." She waved them back through a side door. "Let's have a look." In the exam room, Ranger sat calmly on the table. He didn't flinch at the touch of the stethoscope, didn't growl when she checked his ears or paws. "He's older," Eliza noted, "probably around 6. No microchip, no visible injuries. Dehydrated, but otherwise healthy." She paused, then added, "He's been through something. Not just physically, you can see it in the way he holds himself." Henry nodded. "He hasn't made a sound." "Some dogs don't have to," she said. On the way out, Eliza handed him a small envelope of vitamins and a bottle of eardrops. "You keeping him?" she asked. Henry hesitated, "Just for a few days, until I figure things out." She raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Sometimes a few days turns into something else. Henry drove back through the sleepy town center past the diner, the post office, and the small school building with its peeling white paint. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat watching the road with the steady calm of a co-pilot who didn't need to navigate. Back at the cabin, Henry left the crate by the woodshed and opened the door. Ranger entered cautiously, sniffing the air, the doorframe, the baseboards. He didn't lift a paw or mark territory. He simply walked in as if the house had been waiting for him, too. Henry rolled out an old rug beside the fireplace and filled a bowl with water. Ranger drank without hurry, then lay down facing the door. That afternoon, as Henry chopped kindling by the shed, he caught movement from the corner of his eye, a small figure half hidden behind a pine tree near the fence line. He didn't call out, just waited. Eventually, the figure stepped forward, a girl, maybe 10 years old, with long chestnut hair tied in 2 messy braids. She wore a blue windbreaker, several sizes too big jeans, with one knee patched in red thread, and rain boots flecked with dried mud. Her eyes were wide, curious, and carried the wariness of someone used to being ignored. This was Abigail Monroe, known to most folks as Abby. She lived with her grandmother 2 cabins down the road. Her parents had left town 3 years ago chasing work and never looked back. Abby, however, had stayed. She had a softness to her that came from being alone too much, and a stubborn streak that made her hard to dismiss. She had once owned a golden retriever named Scout, who had gone missing the winter before last. People said coyotes probably got him. Abby never believed it. She pointed at Ranger. "That your dog Henry wiped the sweat from his brow. Found him, or maybe he found me. Not sure yet. What's his name? Tag says Ranger. Abby tilted her head. Can I pet him? He's still getting used to things, Henry said, but maybe later. She nodded, disappointed but understanding. She stood there a moment longer, then turned and disappeared between the trees. That night, Ranger lay beside the front door again, his head resting on his paws. Henry made soup, ate in silence, then read a page and a half of a novel he hadn't touched in over a year. When he looked up, Ranger's eyes were on him, not pleading, not expectant, just present, like he was cataloging every breath, every sound. When Henry went to bed, the dog stayed in the hallway guarding nothing and everything at once. The next afternoon, Abby returned. She didn't knock, just stood in the yard again watching. Henry stepped outside and said, "He's still quiet, but he doesn't mind you being near." She nodded and sat cross-legged in the grass about 5 feet away from Ranger. The dog looked at her ears flicking, then settled back down. This routine repeated each day, the silent girl and the silent dog saying nothing, sharing something. By the 5th day, Ranger walked toward her first. The morning was unusually quiet, even for Willow Creek. A soft frost had settled over the ground outside, turning the pine needles silver and making the edges of the porch steps slick and pale. Inside the cabin, Henry Dalton stood in the kitchen slowly stirring his coffee, the air around him thick with silence. Then, for the first time since he arrived, Ranger barked. The sound was sharp and sudden, echoing down the hallway and startling Henry into action. He followed the sound to the mudroom and found Ranger standing stiffly in front of the old wooden crate. The dog's eyes were fixed intense, locked onto the object like it had come to life. He barked again, short and focused. Henry frowned and approached. Ranger didn't move from his spot. His body was alert but not aggressive, as though he were waiting for something urging Henry to act. Henry knelt beside the crate, ran his fingers along the edges, then beneath it. Something felt different. His hand brushed against the uneven grain, and he discovered a hidden seam in the underside. Curious, he worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. Out came a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and soft with age. Henry unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was neat and slanted, written with ink that had bled slightly into the paper over time. The note was brief. "If you're reading this, please take care of Ranger. He will only trust you if your heart is quiet enough." There was no signature, only silence. Henry stared at the note for a long time. Then he looked at Ranger. The dog had stopped barking. He now sat calmly watching him as if he had said everything that needed saying. And in that moment, Henry felt it not the weight of obligation, but something deeper. Ranger wasn't just a lost dog. He wasn't just something to be fed and sheltered. He had been sent. The cabin stood silent beneath a ceiling of low gray clouds, the kind that pressed against the tops of the pines like a weight. A soft wind carried the smell of wood smoke and melting snow. Inside, Henry Dalton sat at the kitchen table, Walter's letter folded neatly beside his mug. Ranger lay stretched across the floor, head on his front paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Since that morning when the dog had barked at the crate, something had shifted. Not outwardly. Ranger still didn't make noise, didn't demand, but the air around him felt different, like the quiet had taken on a direction, a purpose. That sense of purpose became clear the next day. Henry had just returned from stacking firewood when he noticed Ranger wasn't lying in his usual spot. The front door was shut, the house locked, but the dog was gone. He found him upstairs in the far end of the hallway, a place Henry rarely ventured. It had once been used as storage and still smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. Ranger sat in front of a low dresser tail, still eyes fixed on the second drawer from the bottom. Henry opened it. Inside were old receipts, a rusted flashlight, and a small leather-bound notebook. Curious, Henry flipped it open. Inside were short entries written in the same slanted handwriting as the letter in the crate. The pages were filled with single-sentence thoughts, quiet philosophies, and fleeting reflections. Forgiveness is for the living. Some silences are chosen, others are survived. He doesn't bark because he listens. There was no introduction, no explanation. Just fragments like echoes of conversations never spoken aloud. Henry sat down on the floor beside Ranger and read each page in silence. That evening, Ranger paced by the attic door. Henry hadn't been up there in months. He pulled down the ladder, and the dog climbed up behind him without hesitation. The attic was low-ceilinged, and cramped its wooden floor scattered with dust and old boxes. Ranger walked to the far corner and sat beside an antique trunk, the leather cracked and hinges rusted. Henry opened it carefully. Inside were folded maps, yellowed and marked in pencil. One had a trail sketched through the forest just north of Willow Creek, with tiny notations. First, Snowfall Scout found a bird here camped beneath stars. Another map showed the town itself, circles drawn around the diner, the library a bench near the edge of the river. At the bottom of the trunk, beneath a wool blanket, Henry found more notes, all addressed to no one. If you're holding this, it means Ranger trusts you. Don't look for instructions. Just follow what feels honest. Henry sat in the attic until the light faded and his hands were stained with dust and graphite. He didn't understand everything Walter had left behind, but he knew now that this dog was not a stray. Ranger had come with a story, and that story hadn't ended. The next afternoon, as Henry brought down the attic box to sort through the contents in better light, he heard music drifting from the edge of the property. He stepped onto the porch and saw Abby sitting cross-legged in the grass with a small square radio beside her. She looked up and waved shyly. "It's jazz," she called out. "You like it?" Henry started to shake his head, but stopped when he noticed Ranger. The dog had emerged from the doorway, ears perked, head tilted. He moved closer to the sound slowly, cautiously, then sat beside Abby without being asked. She turned the volume up just slightly. The trumpet was soft, slow, weaving through the cool spring air. "He likes it," she said. Henry stepped down and approached. "Where'd you get the radio?" "It was my mom's. She left it in the closet when they moved." Her voice was even matter-of-fact. "She used to play this song when she cooked." Ranger lay down, his front paws, crossed eyes half closed. He was still, but there was something in his posture, recognition maybe, or memory. "My grandma said there was a man in town who used to sit in the diner and sketch while listening to jazz on a cassette player," Abby added. She didn't know his name, just that he had a big quiet dog who looked kind of like Ranger. Henry felt something settle in his chest, an invisible line beginning to form thread connecting pieces. "Did he ever talk?" Henry asked. Abby shrugged. She said he asked for sweet tea every time, and always left a napkin folded like a crane. Henry didn't know what to say. Ranger shifted eyes on the trees, the music still humming behind them. Later that night, Henry brought the maps and notes to the living room, spreading them across the floor. Ranger lay beside him, nose against one edge of a map, like he could smell the past. The cabin, once so still and airless, now felt like it was waking up, breathing again through its floorboards and forgotten corners. Every drawer Ranger led him to, every page uncovered, spoke not just of Walter, but of a kind of love that didn't vanish with absence. A love that had known silence and left behind breadcrumbs for someone else to find. The morning was crisp and dry, the sky clear and pale, like a memory slowly fading from view. The wind whispered through the pine boughs with a softness that made the world feel older. Henry Dalton stood at the edge of the gravel road leading to the Willow Grove Cemetery, an overgrown hillside plot 3 miles out of town that most people had long since stopped visiting. He held the folded map from Walter's trunk in one hand, the penciled X marked near a large oak tree, drawing him forward like a quiet voice in his chest. Ranger walked beside him without leash or command, his gait, steady eyes, focused tail still. The cemetery had no formal entrance, just a sagging wooden sign barely legible beneath the moss willow grove. Estern's 1892. The gravel path curved inward, then vanished beneath a layer of pine needles and scattered leaves. Tombstones, some leaning. Some broken, poked out from under the underbrush like forgotten teeth in a tired mouth. The place was quiet, but not empty. It felt watched, not in a haunted way, but as if the past still lingered politely in the air. Ranger veered slightly nose to the ground and led Henry through the rows of weathered markers. They passed names neither of them recognized: Clara Whitmore, 1908, 1910. Elijah Barr, 1877, 1943. Finally, the dog stopped, his paws planted firmly before a small granite headstone, simple in shape but lovingly cleaned. The engraving read, Walter Greaves, 1944-2023. He listened more than he spoke. Ranger sat and did not move. His body was quiet, but the set of his shoulders, the way he gazed at the stone without blinking, told Henry this was no casual stop. The wind stirred around them, ruffling Ranger's thick fur, lifting the ends of Henry's coat. Neither of them spoke. Behind him, a crunch of footsteps. Henry turned to see a man in his mid-40s walking slowly down the path, holding a bundle of faded wildflowers. He wore jeans, a brown corduroy jacket, and hiking boots dusted in dried earth. His face was worn, but not unkind, with short dark hair peppered at the temples, and a narrow crease between his brows that seemed permanent. He paused a few steps away when he saw Ranger. The man's breath caught. No way, he murmured. He looked at Henry. Where did you find that dog? Henry hesitated. In a crate. From a garage sale. Long story. He studied the man's expression. You knew him. The man stepped closer, his eyes fixed on Ranger. I did. His name's Ranger. My dad used to call him his better half. He dropped to one knee slowly and reached a tentative hand toward the dog. Ranger didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned forward, slightly sniffed the man's wrist, then sat again, closer this time. My name's Greg, the man said. Greg Greaves. Walter was my father. Greg looked down at the headstone, then back to Ranger. I haven't seen him in over 10 years. We stopped talking after a lot of things. I moved to Missoula. He stayed. We weren't good at fixing what got broken. His voice dipped quieter. I didn't even know he was gone until I read it in the newspaper. No funeral, no family left. Just a line in the obituaries. Henry stayed silent. There was nothing useful to say. Greg continued. He used to write letters, never sent them. I always figured it was just his way of talking to the world without getting hurt again. I didn't think he'd leave anything behind, but that dog, his voice cracked slightly. He's the one thing I remember him loving without reservation. Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the letter Walter had left in the crate. He unfolded it and held it out. Greg read the note slowly, mouth tightening as he reached the end. His hand trembled slightly. He really did mean it, Greg whispered. He really wanted someone to find Ranger, someone quiet enough to earn his trust. They stood in silence for a long time, both men watching the dog who now lay at the foot of the grave as still as the stone behind him. It wasn't just grief Ranger held. It was memory and presence. Eventually, Greg straightened. You keeping him? Henry looked at Ranger. I think he's keeping me. Greg gave a small laugh that didn't quite make it to his eyes. That sounds about right. A soft voice interrupted them. He said that once. They both turned to see Martha Monroe Abbey's grandmother standing on the edge of the cemetery path. She wore a heavy wool coat and a scarf wrapped around her short silver hair. Her face was lined with the kind of age that came more from worry than time, but her eyes were steady. Martha nodded toward Ranger. Walter told me years ago, Ranger doesn't go to people because they ask. He goes to the one who needs him. I thought it was just a poetic thing an old man says when he's lonely. But now, she stepped closer. Now, I think it was true. Greg looked surprised to see her. You knew him? Only a little, Martha replied. He used to come by my shop, bought molasses and peppermint, said they reminded him of his wife. She paused. He never said much, but he always asked about Abby. Henry's eyebrows lifted. Why, Abby? Martha shook her head. Never said. Just smiled and asked if she was still kind. Ranger stood, walked toward Martha, and brushed gently against her leg. She reached down, touched the top of his head. Greg watched quietly, then turned to Henry. I don't need to take him. I think he's right where he belongs. But I'd like to visit sometimes, if that's all right. Henry nodded. Of course. The three of them stood in silence, a triangle of grief and memory, and something just beginning to heal. That night, back at the cabin, Henry wrote in his notebook. Ranger brought me to Walter, then to Greg, and somehow to myself. This isn't just a dog. He's a thread stitched through hearts that forgot how to hold one another. Ranger lay at his usual spot near the fire. Abby would visit again tomorrow, and the story, it seemed, was far from over. The morning after their visit to the cemetery dawned warmer than expected, as if Willow Creek itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window in soft golden stripes, dancing along the floorboards like some quiet invitation. Henry Dalton stood over the stove, waiting for the kettle to whistle Ranger lying at his usual spot near the fireplace, but there was a shift in the dog's behavior. He wasn't resting. He was watching the bookshelf, not staring off in its direction, but truly watching it, ears slightly forward, body alert, in a way Henry had come to recognize. It was the same posture Ranger had taken before leading him to the attic, the dresser, drawer, the grave. Henry set the kettle aside and crossed the room, following the dog's gaze to the corner bookshelf that had stood untouched since the day he moved in. It was built into the wall, crooked, along one side stacked with forgotten paperbacks, field guides, and dust-coated National Geographics from decades past. Ranger rose and patted over, placing one paw gently, deliberately on the second shelf from the bottom. Henry crouched, ran his fingers along the back, and knocked lightly. One segment gave a different sound hollow. He leaned in closer and noticed a gap barely wider than a pencil hidden behind a warped spine of an old cookbook. With effort, he pried back a loose wooden panel and reached into the dark space behind it. Out came a small tin box, cool to the touch and covered in a fine layer of dust. It was rectangular, the size of a lunchbox, and bore faint initials scratched into the lid WG. Henry brought it to the table and opened it with slow, steady hands. Inside, arranged with quiet precision, were several small bundles of folded paper tied with twine. Some were letters, others pages torn from notebooks. One envelope, clearly more recent, lay on top. The handwriting was unmistakable Walter's. If you're reading this, it means Ranger trusts you, and if he trusts you, I do too. These are the pieces I never found the courage to send. Not because they weren't worth sharing, but because I thought I had time. If you think Greg is ready, pass them on. If not, burn them. Either way, thank you. Henry stared at the box, then glanced at Ranger. The dog had returned to his place by the fire, but now lay with his head resting on his paws, eyes closed, not in sleep, but something else. A kind of peace. That afternoon, Henry called Greg. The man arrived within the hour, his truck kicking up dust as it rolled up the gravel driveway. He looked more rested than the last time they'd met, though his expression still held a quiet tension, someone unused to reaching backward but willing to try. Inside, Henry placed the tin box gently on the kitchen table. "I think these were meant for you," he said. Greg stared at the box like it might bite him. Then slowly he untied the first bundle. The room went still. He read in silence for several minutes. Some of the letters were short, simple notes. "I saw a blue heron today. Made me think of the lake trips we used to take." Others were longer confessions in the margins. "I didn't know how to be soft when you needed softness. I knew how to build fences, not bridges." A few pages in, Greg stopped reading. His hands shook slightly. Henry poured 2 mugs of coffee and sat without speaking. Ranger lay close, not at Greg's feet, but near enough to be present, a bridge of fur and breath and memory. "He did love me," Greg said at last. "He just didn't know how to say it." Henry nodded. "I don't hate him anymore," Greg added. I stopped hating him a long time ago. I just didn't know how to stop carrying it." They talked for a while, quiet talk, soft talk, the kind that comes after truths are no longer sharp. When Greg left that day, he took the box with him. "I'll read the rest tonight," he said. "Maybe then I'll write him something back, even if it's just for me." After the door closed and the truck disappeared down the road, Henry turned to find Ranger no longer by the fire. Instead, he was outside on the porch with Abby. The girl was kneeling, a stick in one hand, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Ranger stood in front of her tail, gently wagging. Then, without any prompt, he leapt forward, grabbed the stick and trotted a few feet before dropping it and looking back expectantly. Abby beamed. "He wants to play." Henry stepped out into the light, leaned against the post, and watched as the girl and the dog took turns in their quiet game of fetch. There was no barking, no running wild, just small bursts of joy, controlled, deliberate, but unmistakably joyful. It was the first time Henry had seen Ranger play. Spring came early to Willow Creek that year. The pines grew brighter at their tips, and soft green began to creep back into the meadows, like a memory returning slowly. The cold earth loosened. Birdsong filled the air each morning, and sunlight lingered just a little longer across the wooden floors of Henry Dalton's cabin. On a clear Saturday morning, Henry stood in the center of Willow Grove Park with a folded canvas tucked beneath his arm and a thermos of coffee warming his palm. Beside him, Greg Greaves knelt with a wrench tightening the last bolt on a wooden bench. The new structure stood facing a grove of trees just down the path from the old bandstand. A brass plaque gleamed at its center. "In memory of Walter Greaves." He listened more than he spoke. And sometimes he danced. It had been Abby's idea. 3 days earlier, she had stood barefoot on Henry's porch, her elbows resting on the railing, her eyes squinting against the afternoon sun. She'd said if Ranger had a favorite spot with Walter, it should have a place for them. Even if Walter's gone. She had a point. Greg had agreed almost instantly. "I remember this park," he'd said. "Dad used to bring Ranger here when I was little. He'd bring that old tape deck and play Miles Davis near the trees. Said the music sounded better under branches." His voice had caught when he said it, but not in pain, in reverence. Now, as the bench stood finished beneath the rising sun, the three of them, Henry, Greg, and Abby, stepped back to admire it. Ranger trotted ahead, his thick coat, catching morning light tail, lifted ears alert. He sniffed the base of the bench, circled it, then sat at its foot, resting his body like a sentinel beside an old friend. Greg wiped his hands on his jeans and took a long breath. "I think he would have liked this." Henry smiled. "I think he already does." Abby, still holding a paper bag with a thermos of tea and 3 muffins she'd baked with her grandmother, asked, "Can I ask something kind of official?" Henry looked over, curious. "Sure." "Can Ranger come to our place every Saturday?" she said. "Not forever, just for a visit. Just for being part of things. I could read to him. We could walk near the creek. Grandma says it's good for him to keep making memories." Henry glanced at Ranger. The dog had turned to look at Abby with what Henry had come to recognize as his soft, slow blink of agreement. "Yeah," Henry said. "I think Saturdays sound good." Greg chuckled. "Seems like everyone's scheduling time with the old guy." "Speaking of which," he added, voice lowering slightly, "would you mind if I stopped by sometimes? Not to disrupt things. I miss him. And I know he's not exactly here, but this dog he carries something of my father that I think I need to keep close." Henry nodded. "You don't need to ask." The 3 of them sat together on the new bench, watching the soft sway of the trees and listening to the wind. Greg reached down to scratch behind Ranger's ears. The dog didn't move but leaned into the touch just enough to say he remembered. Later that day, back at the cabin, Henry stood before his desk. It was a heavy old thing made of dark oak, worn smooth from years of being ignored. But today it was clear. Cleared of papers, books, distractions. Only one thing sat at its center, a new leather journal, unmarked, its pages blank and patient. He sat down, uncapped his pen, and began to write. This story didn't begin with me. It began with a man who loved a dog and didn't know how to say goodbye. It continued with a son who carried silence like a wound, a girl who still believed every creature should be known, and a stranger who opened a crate and found a heartbeat waiting inside. He paused, glanced toward the fireplace. Ranger was lying in his usual spot, one paw tucked under his chin, tail curled neatly beside him. But his breathing was slower now, deeper content. A dog at rest, not because he was tired, but because finally he didn't have to carry the weight alone. Henry picked up the pen again. If you're reading this, it means the story found you too. And maybe, just maybe, there's something inside it that was meant for you to carry next. The lilacs bloomed early that spring, painting the air with soft purple, and a sweetness so quiet it made people stop mid-sentence. Willow Creek, once a sleepy town nestled between woods and memory, now carried a different kind of rhythm, one punctuated by soft paw steps and the gentle laughter of children reading aloud on park benches. It had been a year since Ranger arrived in Henry Dalton's life inside a crate lined with silence and dust. A year since Henry had opened not just a box, but a second chance. The old dog had since become more than just a presence in Henry's home. He had become part of the town itself. By late March, Ranger had earned an informal title, community therapy dog, though Henry preferred to call him something simpler, a keeper of quiet hearts. It started when Abby, now taller and more certain in her steps, suggested they bring Ranger to visit the local senior center once a week. What began as an experiment soon became a fixture. Every Tuesday afternoon, the residents of Waverly Pines Elder Living waited in their cardigans and slippers, peppermint candies tucked in pockets, just to see him walk through the doors. Ranger, now 10 years old, moved slower, but his eyes still held that steady amber watchfulness. He would settle beside those who spoke the least curl, near the feet of those who once owned dogs they still spoke of in the present tense. One woman, Mrs. Elsie Grant, who wore the same blue shawl every week and smelled faintly of chamomile, always whispered, "You remind me of my Simon." He came to me in winter, too. The program grew. Abby, with a laminated badge that read Junior Volunteer Lead, helped create a weekly group called Dogs and Kids, Healing Through Friendship. Children from the elementary school would read aloud to therapy dogs, Ranger always at the center like a wise old anchor. Some kids were too shy to read to adults, but not to Ranger. To him, they whispered the endings of stories and the beginnings of secrets. Meanwhile, Henry had spent months writing. Every evening he returned to the desk by the window, Walter's old chair pulled close, Ranger curled nearby, and poured the story onto the page. Not just the story of a dog found in a crate, but the chain of hearts he'd quietly mended. Greg Abbey, Martha, even Henry himself. The book, titled The Dog Inside the Crate, was published that spring by a small regional press called Hearthstone Books, run by a freckled, soft-spoken editor named Miriam Lane. She had curly graying hair and always smelled faintly of ink and cinnamon gum. Miriam believed in stories with breath in them, and when she read Henry's manuscript, she said it felt like a hymn sung in fur. The cover was simple, just one image. Ranger, lying in a shaft of morning light by the cabin's back window, the very same corner Walter once called the silent seat. His eyes were closed, his body curved gently like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. The sun outlined him in gold. The photo had been taken by Abby one quiet morning without flash or staging. "It's the real him," she said, "the one who listens to everyone without asking why." The book went modestly wide. Libraries ordered it. A few book clubs read it and cried over Chapter 6. One school invited Henry to speak, but he sent Abby instead. "She's the beginning of the next part," he said. That final spring, Ranger moved slower. He no longer fetched sticks, but he still wagged his tail when Abby arrived with a scarf in her hand, or when Greg sat beside him in silence. He still nudged Henry's foot when the man paused too long between sentences. Then, on the first Sunday of May, under the earliest lilac bloom anyone in Willow Creek could remember, Ranger curled beneath the bush just outside Henry's cabin. The breeze was soft, the sun not too hot, the earth around him still carrying the warmth of the morning. He lay his head on his paws. He blinked once at Henry, who sat quietly on the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Then Ranger closed his eyes. There was no sound, no struggle, just stillness, just breath becoming memory. Abby came later that day, and together with Henry and Greg they buried Ranger beneath the lilac bush, wrapping him in the same old quilt from the crate. They placed a smooth-worn stone above the soil, and tucked beside it a photograph of Ranger lying in the sunlight, same as the book cover. On the back of the photo in Henry's handwriting were the words, "He came in a crate." He left a family. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles arrive in the quietest forms. A folded note, a forgotten crate, or a dog that simply waits. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a gift wrapped in silence, sent not by chance but perhaps by the gentle hands of God himself. Because when we are most lost, heaven often answers not with thunder but with presence. A presence that doesn't fix everything but walks beside us while we find the strength to heal. This story reminds us that God often works through small beginnings. Through a child's kindness, a son's forgiveness, a man's decision to open a box instead of throwing it away. That's where love begins. That's where faith grows. And maybe, just maybe, God places the right souls, whether human or canine, into our lives when we are finally ready to open our hearts. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories that remind us we're not alone. And may God bless everyone watching this. If you believe in quiet miracles and second chances, type Amen in the comments below.